The prison stood on the edge of a quiet town, far enough that people rarely thought about what happened inside those high walls. To outsiders, it was just another gray building with fences and watchtowers. But for the people living inside, every day felt like the same movie played over and over again. The same sounds, the same rules, the same faces. Nothing ever changed. Inside those walls, the mornings started early. The guards would walk down the corridors, keys jingling, calling out for roll call. The air always smelled of coffee mixed with metal and old paint. Most inmates had learned how to live with the routine. You woke up, you followed the rules, you kept your head down, and you waited for time to pass. But lately, something felt different. There was tension in the air, something people didn't talk about out loud but could feel in their bones. A new warden had taken charge a few months back, and everything changed after that. He brought stricter rules, cut down small privileges, and made it clear he didn't believe in second chances. Hot meals were replaced by cold ones, outdoor time was shorter, and even small mistakes led to punishment. It wasn't just about the rules, it was the way people were treated. The older inmates whispered about how things used to be better, when there was a bit of respect between guards and prisoners. Now it was all fear and frustration. Every small spark turned into an argument. People were tired, angry, and quietly waiting for something to give. One of the inmates, a man who had already spent years behind bars, noticed the change more than anyone else. He was calm by nature, rarely talked, but watched everything carefully. He had seen fights, lockdowns, and bad days before, but this felt different. He saw how small things started piling up. A broken heater in the winter, food served half-frozen, medicine delayed for days. He could see it building up like pressure in a closed bottle. One morning during roll call, a young inmate spoke back to a guard. It was something small, a complaint about breakfast, but the guard shouted at him in front of everyone. The hallway went silent except for the sound of that guard's voice echoing off the walls. The young inmate lowered his head and the guard walked away, but everyone had seen it. They didn't talk about it, but they felt it. The look in that inmate's eyes said everything. People were getting tired of being treated like they didn't matter. Later that day, the man who watched everything sat quietly in the common room. The TV was on, but nobody cared about the show. He could hear whispers in different corners, people talking about how unfair things had become, how maybe it was time someone spoke up. But nobody wanted to start something they couldn't finish. Inside those walls, one wrong move could cost everything. The guards, too, were feeling the pressure. They worked long hours, short-staffed and constantly alert. Some of them were decent, trying to do their jobs without trouble. Others enjoyed the power a little too much. The new rules had made things tense even for them. They were told to be tougher, to show authority, to not let anyone question them. That made things worse. In the evenings, when the lights dimmed and everyone returned to their cells, the prison had a strange quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. From his cell, the man could hear footsteps in the hallway, a cough from the next block, and sometimes quiet conversations through the vents. People were restless. Some nights he couldn't sleep because he knew something was coming. He didn't know when, but he could feel it. Weeks passed like that. The rules got tighter. Even the little things that made life bearable were taken away. They stopped weekend movie nights. They reduced visiting hours. The food got worse. The man saw how the frustration grew in everyone, especially the younger ones who didn't know how to stay patient. He tried to calm a few down, told them that acting out would only bring more punishment, but deep down even he was tired. Then one day something unusual happened. The electricity flickered during lunch. The lights went off for a few seconds, and in that short darkness, a few inmates started talking louder than usual. When the power came back, things returned to normal, but everyone was reminded of one thing. The system wasn't perfect. Mistakes could happen, and when they did, anything was possible. That evening, he noticed a group of inmates whispering near the back tables. They weren't loud, but their faces were serious. He didn't join in, but he listened. They talked about how long they could live like this, about what would happen if they stood together. Someone said, "They can't control all of us." Someone else said, "We just need a reason." He didn't say anything, but he knew what that meant. They were thinking about something dangerous. He went back to his cell that night with a heavy heart. He'd seen uprisings before in smaller ways, arguments turning into fights, one group standing against another. But a full-scale rebellion? That never ended well. Still, he understood the feeling. There's a limit to how much a person can take before they stop caring about the consequences. The next morning, the prison felt colder than usual. People were quiet, moving slower, giving short answers to guards. The man could feel that the balance was tipping. It wasn't one person's fault, it was years of small injustices stacked on top of each other. It was the system breaking under its own weight. After breakfast, he went to his work duty in the laundry room. The machines hummed as usual, but even there, the mood was strange. People looked over their shoulders, talking in half-whispers. Someone said that a few inmates from another block had refused to come out of their cells until they got hot meals again. The guards had dragged them out, but not before word spread across the prison. Everyone heard about it, and that little act of defiance planted a seed in everyone's mind. By the afternoon, rumors were everywhere. Some said the warden planned to cancel yard time for the rest of the week. Others said they were going to bring in more guards from another facility. Nobody knew what was true anymore, but the whispers kept growing, and like dry grass waiting for a spark, the whole place was ready to burn. That night, while lying on his bunk, the man stared at the ceiling and thought about freedom. He hadn't seen the sky without bars in years, but he still dreamed about it. He thought about his mistakes, the people he'd hurt, and the years he couldn't get back. All he wanted was peace, to live the rest of his time without chaos. But deep inside, he also knew that peace was impossible when people felt unheard. In the cell next to him, two younger inmates argued in hushed voices about what was coming. One said they had to do something. The other said they'd get caught. The man turned on his side, closed his eyes, and said quietly, "Sometimes doing nothing is worse than doing something wrong." The words hung in the air, and both of them went silent. Outside the window, the night stretched on. The guards did their rounds, the lights buzzed, and the wind blew softly through the small cracks in the wall. Everything looked calm, but everyone knew it was only the calm before the storm. The man didn't know when it would happen, or who would start it. But he knew that soon, something would break. And when it did, nothing inside those walls would ever be the same again. The morning started like any other day. The siren sounded and the gates opened one section at a time. The inmates lined up for breakfast, trays in hand, eyes half open, some still tired from a restless night. But underneath that quiet routine, something was different. The air was heavy. People were watching each other more closely, whispering more quietly, waiting for something they couldn't describe but could feel coming. In the dining hall, steam rose from the trays, but the food was barely warm. It had become a daily complaint, but nobody listened anymore. A few guards walked up and down the aisles, trying to keep order. Most of them avoided eye contact with the inmates, pretending not to notice the frustration building around them. At one of the tables, a young inmate sat staring at his tray. He looked tired, his jaw tight, hands clenched. He pushed the food around but didn't take a bite. The man who had been watching everything over the past weeks noticed him. Something in the young inmate's eyes looked like fire, quiet but ready to burn. He had seen that look before, and he knew it only took one small spark to set things off. When breakfast ended, the guards started calling people back to their cells. Everyone got up slowly, carrying their trays to the window where they were collected. But when the young inmate reached the counter, he didn't move. He stood there, tray still in his hands, shaking his head. One of the guards ordered him to hand it over. The young man's voice came out sharp and loud, cutting through the noise of the hall. "I'm not eating this anymore," he said. "Not this cold food, not like this." The room froze. Every sound stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. The guards exchanged looks. One of them stepped closer, his voice low but tense. "Put the tray down and return to your cell." But the young inmate didn't. He looked straight at the guard and repeated himself, louder this time. "I said I'm not eating this." It wasn't about the food anymore, and everyone knew it. It was about everything that had built up. The broken promises, the constant pressure, the feeling of being treated like they didn't matter. The man watching from across the room could feel the shift. One person had finally said what everyone else had been thinking for weeks. Then someone at another table started banging their tray. It was a dull, rhythmic sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Another inmate joined in, then another. Within seconds, the noise grew louder and louder until it sounded like 100 drums beating at once. The guards shouted for everyone to stop, but nobody listened. The room was filled with clattering metal, shouting voices, and the sound of frustration finally breaking free. The man stood up, looking around. He saw fear and anger mixing together in every face. Some were just following along because they were scared not to. Others were shouting out of pure rage. He tried to calm a few people near him, telling them to stay back to not make things worse, but his voice was lost in the noise. One of the guards ran toward the alarm near the wall. The red light began flashing, followed by a loud siren. The sound echoed through the entire building. Doors started locking down automatically, but in the confusion, something went wrong. The power flickered again, just like it had before. The siren kept blaring, but a few of the electronic locks didn't close properly. One door on the far side of the dining hall stayed open. The young inmate saw it first. He hesitated for a second, then started walking toward it. Others followed, unsure of what to do but unwilling to stay behind. The guards tried to block the way, shouting at them to stop, but there were too many people moving at once. In the chaos, someone pushed past. The man who had been watching everything knew it had gone too far to turn back now. By the time backup arrived, the dining hall was no longer under control. The guards pulled back, sealing off the corridor outside to prevent anyone from escaping further. Inside, the inmates were shouting to each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Some were scared, others excited. Nobody knew what the next step should be. The man walked to the center of the room and tried to get their attention. "Listen to me," he said, raising his voice over the noise. "Don't make this worse than it already is. We can talk, but not if we start fighting." A few turned to look at him, recognizing his calm tone. They trusted him, at least a little. He had never led them into trouble before, but others weren't listening. The adrenaline was too high. People had tasted a strange kind of freedom for the first time in years, even if it only lasted minutes. They felt powerful, like maybe for once they had control of something. The man knew that feeling was dangerous. It could make people do things they'd regret later. Outside, guards were forming a perimeter. The prison's main control room was trying to figure out which systems were still online. The lights flickered again, then steadied. A voice came over the loudspeaker, telling everyone to return to their cells, but nobody moved. The noise in the dining hall grew quieter, but the tension didn't fade. Everyone stood still, waiting for what would happen next. Then came another sound, a loud bang from down the corridor. It wasn't a weapon, just a door slamming hard, but it made everyone jump. A few inmates near the open door started shouting again, saying they should take control of the whole block before the guards came back in. Others argued, saying that would only make things worse. The room was divided between fear and defiance. The man stepped forward again, trying to keep things calm. "We don't want to hurt anyone," he said, looking around. "We just want to be heard. Don't let this turn into something we can't stop." Slowly, a few people began to listen. Some sat down, breathing heavily, shaking from nerves. But a small group near the exit refused to stop. They said they'd come too far to back down now. They didn't want to return to their cells and pretend nothing had happened. The man could see the conflict in their faces, half anger, half desperation. He knew that feeling too well. Minutes turned into an hour. The guards outside didn't move in yet. They were waiting for orders. Inside, the inmates argued about what to do next. Some said they should surrender before it got worse. Others said this was their only chance to speak up, to make someone finally listen. Nobody wanted to be the first to make the wrong move. The man stood near the center of the room, feeling the weight of the moment. He thought about how it all started, with one person refusing a cold meal. Just one small act of defiance had led to all of this. He wondered if it could still end without anyone getting hurt. Outside, the noise of sirens grew louder as more vehicles arrived. The warden was called in, along with local authorities. Reporters had already started gathering at the gates, trying to find out what was going on. Inside the prison, rumors spread faster than the truth. Some said the inmates had taken hostages. Others said it was just a protest. But nobody really knew. As night began to fall, the lights dimmed again. The power was unstable, and the emergency lights turned the hall an eerie shade of orange. The man looked around at the tired faces around him. He saw fear, exhaustion, and a quiet understanding that things would never be the same again. Even if they surrendered now, the memory of this day would stay with them forever. He walked to a corner, sat down, and leaned against the wall. His heart was heavy. He knew that by morning everything would change, maybe for the worse. But deep down he also knew that something inside all of them had already shifted. They had found their voice, even if the world outside didn't hear it yet. It had started with a single tray of cold food, but what it really was about went far deeper than that. It was about dignity, respect, and the silent pain of being forgotten. And now that silence had finally broken. Night had fallen over the prison, but no one was sleeping. The place that usually followed a strict routine had turned into something completely different. The sirens had stopped, but the tension hadn't. The guards had pulled back from the dining hall and locked down the other sections, leaving one full block of inmates in control. For the first time, they weren't behind bars. They were inside the space the guards usually ruled. The man who had watched everything from the beginning sat quietly near the wall, thinking about what had just happened. Around him, voices mixed with nervous laughter and fear. Some inmates were pacing, unable to stand still. Others were sitting in groups, whispering about what to do next. Nobody really knew what the plan was. They had control of one section, but that was it. The rest of the prison was locked tight, and the guards were outside waiting. He knew the situation couldn't last long. The authorities wouldn't just let them stay in charge, but rushing to end it now might make things worse. He looked around and saw a few faces he recognized, people who had always kept calm even in hard times. He called them over and said, "We need to keep this under control. No fighting, no panic. If we lose control, it's over." They agreed, forming a small group to try and keep peace among the inmates. They started checking on the others, making sure no one got too aggressive or tried to break into other areas. The last thing they wanted was chaos that would make things spiral beyond repair. Outside, the prison yard was full of flashing lights. Police cars, vans, and officials stood behind the fences, planning their next move. The warden was on the phone with higher authorities, trying to figure out how to regain control without causing harm. The media had already arrived. Cameras were pointed at the walls, and reporters were talking about a developing situation inside the prison. Inside, the mood shifted from excitement to unease. The first rush of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a strange quiet. Some inmates started to realize how serious things had become. The man could see it in their faces. They weren't angry anymore. They were scared. One of the younger inmates walked up to him and asked, "What happens now?" The man looked at him for a moment and said, "Now we think. No more shouting, no more rushing. We talk first." The group gathered near the dining hall tables to discuss what to do. They all knew they couldn't win by force, but maybe they could make people listen. The man suggested they ask to speak with someone outside, someone in charge who would hear them out. They needed to explain why things had reached this point and what they wanted. It wasn't freedom they were asking for, just fairness. Decent food, working heaters, a bit of respect. For the first time that night, there was silence. Everyone listened as he spoke. He wasn't trying to lead anyone. He was just being honest. "We didn't plan this," he said. "It happened because we got tired of being treated like we don't matter. But if we turn this into a war, no one wins. We talk, we stay calm, and maybe they'll finally hear us." The others nodded slowly. Some still looked doubtful. But they didn't have a better idea. After all, the man had been there longer than most of them. He understood how the system worked. He knew that if they gave the authorities a reason to use force, they would. Hours passed. The guards outside the doors shouted for updates through the speakers, but nobody answered. The man walked closer to the intercom near the wall and pressed the button. "We're not hurting anyone," he said. "We just want to talk." His voice echoed down the empty corridors. There was a pause, then a calm voice replied, "Who am I speaking to?" The man hesitated for a moment before saying, "Just someone who wants to end this the right way." The voice said they'd bring in a negotiator in the morning. Until then, everyone needed to stay calm. No one would come in, and no one would come out. The man agreed. He knew it was the best option for now. The inmates needed rest and the guards needed time to plan. When morning came, the sun rose over the prison yard. From inside, the light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Some inmates had fallen asleep on benches or against walls. Others sat quietly, heads in their hands, lost in thought. The man hadn't slept at all. His mind kept replaying everything that had happened, from the first argument in the dining hall to the moment they took over the block. Around mid-morning, the intercom crackled again. The same calm voice returned. "We have someone here who wants to speak to you," it said. The man nodded and signaled for everyone to quiet down. The negotiator's voice came through next, measured, polite, not shouting. "I understand things got out of hand," he said, "but we can fix this without anyone getting hurt. I need to know what you want." The man took a deep breath and replied, "We want to be treated like people. That's all. We want food that's not spoiled. We want the heating fixed. We want someone to listen when we file complaints. We don't want violence." There was a pause before the negotiator spoke again. "That's a fair start," he said. "But we need to make sure everyone is safe. Can you promise me that?" "Yes," the man said. "No one is hurt. We don't want that." The conversation continued for a while. The negotiator asked questions, trying to understand the situation inside. The man answered honestly, telling him about the broken conditions and the frustration that led to the protest. For the first time, someone on the outside was listening. It didn't fix everything, but it brought a small bit of hope. While the two talked, not everyone was as calm. A few inmates were losing patience. They whispered that talking wouldn't change anything, that the authorities would break their promises once things ended. The man overheard them and walked over. "Listen," he said quietly. "I know you don't trust them. I don't either. But if we give them a reason to storm in, we'll lose everything. If we stay calm, at least they have to hear us." It wasn't easy convincing them, but his calmness helped. He didn't speak like someone giving orders. He spoke like someone who understood their anger. Slowly, the tension began to settle again. The inmates moved back toward the main room, waiting for news. Outside, the negotiator met with the warden and officers. He told them the inmates were talking peacefully and that no one was injured. The warden was still on edge, but he agreed to keep the situation calm. The last thing anyone wanted was a violent standoff that could make things worse. By afternoon, the news had spread everywhere. Reporters outside the prison fence were broadcasting live updates. Families of inmates stood in the cold, holding signs and waiting for information. Nobody knew exactly what was happening inside, only that a group of inmates had taken control and were asking to be heard. Inside, the man looked out through the small window high on the wall. He couldn't see much, just a strip of sky, but it reminded him of the world outside. He wondered how long it had been since he'd seen a sunrise without bars in front of it. Maybe years. He didn't know if this protest would change anything, but for the first time he felt like their voices might reach beyond these walls. Evening came, and food was finally sent in. It wasn't much, sandwiches and bottles of water, but it was something. The negotiator had arranged it as a sign of good faith. The inmates accepted it quietly. Nobody cheered or celebrated. They just ate in silence, grateful for a small piece of peace in the middle of all the uncertainty. The man sat near the doorway, chewing slowly, his mind still turning. He knew they had bought themselves time, but time could work against them too. If the authorities lost patience, everything could fall apart. He needed to make sure that didn't happen. Before night fell, he pressed the intercom again. "We're holding steady," he said. "We'll keep things calm as long as no one tries to come in." The negotiator's voice came back, steady and reassuring. "That's good to hear. Keep everyone safe tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk again." The man nodded even though the other couldn't see him. He turned to look around the room. Some inmates were already lying down, exhausted. Others sat in quiet groups, their voices low. The chaos of the night before had turned into a fragile calm. He leaned his head back against the wall, feeling the rough concrete against his skin. His body was tired, but his mind was racing. He didn't know how this story would end, but he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened next, the truth of what they had done would never be forgotten. For once, the silence of the prison had been broken, and the world outside was finally listening. The sun rose slowly over the prison the next morning, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gray. From inside the locked block, the man watched the thin light creep across the floor. It was quiet, too quiet. After 2 long nights of tension and fear, everyone was tired. The noise, the shouting, the sirens, all of it had faded into silence. But underneath that calm, everyone knew it wasn't over. Some of the inmates were still asleep on the floor using jackets as pillows. Others sat quietly, rubbing their eyes, wondering what would happen next. The man stood up, stretched his sore back, and looked around. He could feel that the mood had changed. The anger that had started everything was now replaced by worry. People were thinking about their families, their cases, their futures. They didn't want to spend the rest of their lives paying for something that had started with frustration. After a while, the intercom on the wall crackled to life again. The same calm voice they'd heard the day before spoke. "We're here to talk," it said. "Can you hear me?" The man walked closer and pressed the button. "We hear you," he said. His voice was steady, though his heart was beating fast. "Good," the negotiator replied. "Let's take this one step at a time. I've spoken with the warden. He's willing to listen to your concerns, but you need to show us that things are peaceful inside. Can you do that?" The man turned and looked around. Most of the inmates were watching him, waiting for his answer. "It's calm," he said finally. "Nobody's hurt. We just want this to end the right way." "Then let's talk," the voice said. "Tell me what you need." The man took a deep breath and began. He spoke about the small things first, the food, the broken heaters, the poor medical care. Then he talked about the bigger things, the way they were treated, the lack of respect, the feeling that they were invisible to the world. He didn't shout or make threats. He spoke like someone who had carried those feelings for years and was finally letting them out. The negotiator listened without interrupting. Every few minutes he asked a question, trying to understand more. "You're saying it's not just about the food?" he asked. "It's never just about the food," the man said. "It's about being treated like human beings." There was a pause. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment, and when it returned it sounded softer. "I hear you," the negotiator said. "Give me some time. I'll talk to the warden again." The intercom went silent. Inside, the inmates waited. Some looked hopeful, others suspicious. One of the younger men stood up and said, "You really think they'll listen?" "They never do." The man turned to him. "Maybe not," he said honestly. "But if we don't try, then this all means nothing." The young man didn't argue after that. He just sat down staring at the floor. Hours passed slowly. The man walked around, talking to different groups, reminding them to stay calm. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He hadn't asked to be the one speaking for everyone, but somehow that's what had happened. People were looking to him for direction, and he couldn't let them down. Outside the prison, the situation had turned into a national story. News crews were camped outside the gates, showing live footage of flashing lights and fences topped with wire. Families of inmates gathered nearby, holding signs that said things like, "We just want them safe." Some were crying, some praying. Inside, the inmates didn't know any of that. They only had the man's voice and the negotiator's calm tone to hold on to. By afternoon, the intercom buzzed again. The negotiator's voice returned. "I spoke with the warden," he said. "He's agreed to hear your requests officially. But for that to happen, you'll need to start letting us back into the block, one step at a time. No tricks, no force. Just a conversation." The man hesitated. He didn't fully trust the offer. He knew that once the guards came in, they'd lose control again. But he also knew they couldn't stay like this forever. "We'll talk about it," he said. He turned to the others and explained what the negotiator had said. The room filled with voices again, some hopeful, some angry. A few inmates shouted that it was a trap. Others said they just wanted to go back to their cells before things got worse. The man listened to them all, then raised his hand for silence. "Listen," he said firmly. "We can't keep this going forever. We said from the beginning we didn't want to hurt anyone. If we keep our word, maybe they'll keep theirs. We end this peacefully, and at least we'll be remembered for that." It took time, but slowly heads began to nod. People were tired of waiting, tired of fear. They wanted it to be over. That evening, the man pressed the intercom again. "We'll let you in to talk," he said. "But only one person. No weapons, no tricks. We keep our word, you keep yours." The negotiator agreed. "Understood," he said. "I'll come in myself." When the doors finally opened, the sound of metal grinding filled the room. Everyone went still. The negotiator walked in slowly, hands visible, wearing a calm expression. He wasn't dressed like a guard, no uniform, no weapon. Just a man in a simple shirt and jacket carrying a notepad. The man stepped forward to meet him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The negotiator spoke first. "You've done well keeping everyone calm," he said quietly. "That's not easy," the man nodded. "We just want it to end." The negotiator sat down at one of the tables and began writing notes. They talked for hours. The man explained everything again, and the negotiator promised to carry those words to the warden directly. He didn't make false promises. He didn't say things would change overnight. He just said he would do his best to make sure the truth was heard. When the negotiator finally stood up to leave, he turned to the inmates and said, "If you keep things peaceful tonight, we'll move forward tomorrow morning. No one here has to get hurt." "I mean that," the man nodded again. He could see that the negotiator was sincere. For the first time in days, he felt a small flicker of hope. When the doors closed again, he turned to the others. "We hold on one more night," he said. "Tomorrow we end this." That night the prison was quiet again. The guards outside remained alert, but they didn't move in. Inside, the inmates tried to rest. Some whispered quietly about what they would say to their families if they got the chance. Others just stared at the ceiling, too tired to speak. The man sat near the door, his eyes half closed, listening to the soft sounds of people breathing. He thought about the choices they'd made, about how one small act of defiance had led to all of this. He didn't regret standing up for what was right, but he hoped it wouldn't cost anyone their future. Outside, the night was cold. The negotiator stood by his car, talking quietly on his phone. "They're scared," he said. "But they're not violent. They just want to be heard. If we handle this right, no one gets hurt." The person on the other end of the call agreed, and plans were made for the next morning. As the hours passed, the man couldn't sleep. His thoughts drifted between the past and the present, the mistakes that had put him there and the strange sense of purpose he now felt. Maybe this was his way of making something right, even in a place built on wrongs. When dawn finally came, he stood up and looked at the dim light creeping through the window again. It felt like a new beginning, or maybe the end of something long and painful. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready to face it. He knew he had done his part, to keep people safe, to keep hope alive, and to remind the world outside that even behind walls and wire, people still had voices that deserved to be heard. The morning came quietly with a soft fog hanging over the yard. The prison looked peaceful from the outside, but everyone inside knew how fragile that peace really was. The man stood near the window, staring out through the bars. He could see the faint movement of guards beyond the walls, hear the low hum of engines from the vehicles parked outside. Today was the day it would end, one way or another. He turned to face the others. Some of the inmates were already awake, pacing nervously, while others sat quietly, lost in thought. Nobody spoke much. The long days of fear and tension had drained their energy, leaving behind only silence and uncertainty. A little after sunrise, the intercom came to life again. The familiar, calm voice of the negotiator filled the room. "Good morning," he said. "We're ready to move forward. The warden has agreed to meet your representative. If things stay peaceful, this can end without harm." The man listened carefully. He could tell from the tone that this was real. "We're ready too," he said, pressing the button. "Just keep your word." "I will," the negotiator replied. "I'm coming in again." "We'll take it slow." The line went quiet. For a few minutes no one moved. Then the heavy steel door creaked open. The negotiator stepped in, just like before. Hands visible, voice calm, no guards behind him. The man walked forward to meet him. The two nodded at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They sat at one of the tables again. The air was tense, but it wasn't hostile. The negotiator placed a folder on the table. "These are the terms," he said. "You release control of this block peacefully. In return, the warden will listen to your requests formally. I can't promise everything will change, but this is the first real step." The man nodded slowly. "And no one gets hurt?" he asked. "No one," the negotiator said. "That's my word." The man looked around the room. Everyone was watching. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also the hope. For days they had been trapped between anger and desperation. But now they had a choice. He took a deep breath and said, "We'll do it. We'll end this now." The negotiator stood and extended his hand. The man hesitated, then shook it. The room was completely still. For the first time since it all began, there was no shouting, no noise, just the sound of two men trying to trust each other. When the negotiator left to prepare the next steps, the man turned to the others. "Start cleaning up," he said quietly. "Pick up what we can. Let's leave this place better than it was." No one argued. Some began folding blankets. Others cleared the tables or stacked chairs. It wasn't much, but it was something that made them feel human again. As they worked, the man thought about how strange it was, how chaos had brought out the worst and best in people at the same time. He remembered how it started: frustration, anger, hopelessness. It wasn't about power. It was about being heard. And somehow, in the middle of all that noise and fear, they had managed to hold on to their humanity. By noon, the doors opened again. Guards stood outside this time, but they didn't rush in. They stood back, waiting for a signal. The negotiator stepped in again and nodded. "It's time," he said. "We're ready." The man turned back to his group. "Stay calm," he told them. "No sudden moves. Just walk out slow." One by one, the inmates began walking toward the open door. Some kept their heads down. Others glanced nervously at the guards. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the hall. It felt like walking out of a storm, uncertain but necessary. The man waited until everyone else had gone before he stepped forward himself. As he reached the doorway, he paused and looked back at the room. The place that had been filled with shouting, anger, and fear now looked empty and quiet again. It was strange how quickly things could change. He took one last look, then stepped outside. The sunlight hit his face as he crossed into the yard. It felt warm and real, something he hadn't noticed in days. Guards watched him closely but didn't move. The negotiator walked beside him, keeping his pace slow and steady. They were led to a separate area near the warden's office. The air there felt different, tense but controlled. The warden sat behind a long desk, his face unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the negotiator said, "This is the man who helped keep things peaceful." The warden looked up. "I've heard about you," he said. "You've caused a lot of trouble." The man met his eyes. "We didn't want trouble," he said quietly. "We wanted someone to listen." The warden leaned back in his chair. "You've got my attention now," he said. "Speak," and so the man did. He talked about everything. Broken systems, mistreatment, the small problems that had grown into something big. He spoke not with anger, but with honesty. Every word came from a place of truth. The negotiator listened carefully, nodding at the right moments. The warden took notes, though his face remained stiff. When the man finished, there was silence for a while. Then the warden said, "You know, you've made things complicated for everyone here. But I'll admit, you've also made some good points." The man nodded. "That's all we wanted," he said. For someone to admit things could be better. The warden didn't answer right away. Finally, he stood up and said, "You'll be moved back to your cell for now. But we'll review what you've said. I can't promise miracles, but I'll see what can be done." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was something. The man accepted it with a nod. As the guards escorted him away, he felt strangely calm. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel powerless. The rest of the inmates were also returned to their cells. Some were scared, thinking punishment would follow. But nothing violent happened. Things moved quietly. Meals were served again. Medical checks were done. And over the next few days, a slow return to routine began. Word spread among the inmates that things might start to change. Small things at first. New rules for work hours, slightly better meals. Repairs being made in the old units. It wasn't much, but it gave people something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A week later, the negotiator came back to visit. He walked down the corridor until he found the man sitting on his bunk. "I told you I'd keep my word," he said with a faint smile. The man nodded. "And I'm glad you did," he said. "It means something." They talked for a while, not about the takeover, but about life. About how sometimes, even in the darkest places, people find ways to stand up for what matters. Before leaving, the negotiator said, "You changed more than you think." After he left, the man sat quietly, staring at the small window in his cell. The sunlight poured in just enough to warm his hands. He thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the anger, the choices. In a strange way, it had brought out a sense of unity among people who rarely trusted anyone. Days turned into weeks. The tension faded and the story slowly disappeared from the news. But inside those walls, people remembered. They remembered the days they took control, not for revenge, but to prove that their voices mattered. The man never saw himself as a leader, but that's what he had become. Sometimes other inmates would come to him for advice or just to talk. He listened, gave honest answers, and told them something he had learned the hard way. Change doesn't always come fast, but it starts when someone decides not to stay silent. Late one night, as the lights dimmed and the halls grew quiet, he lay back on his bunk and thought about freedom. Not just the kind outside the walls, but the kind that comes from knowing you did something that mattered. He knew he might spend years behind those bars, but deep down, he felt something had shifted. Not just in the prison, but inside himself. The world outside would move on, and people might forget the details of what happened. But those who lived through it would never forget the feeling of standing up, of being heard even for a moment. And in that small victory, there was a kind of peace that no one could take away.